Thank you so much for coming. What I'd like to do today is give you a brief overview of my book, which is called When Books Went to War. I think when we think about World War II, we usually think about Pearl Harbor, and that's where the war started for America. But what I'd like to do is go back to 1933 in Berlin, Germany, because this was a time when students were going into libraries and taking books out. And that might not sound that impressive, but they weren't taking books out to read. They were taking books so that they would no longer be in circulation in German libraries. They thought that there were certain books, certain authors, certain topics that were dangerous. And they actually would make Germany weaker by having people read about them. And so they thought that they would take these ideas out of circulation and people would forget about them. So after spending several months doing this, on May 10th, 1933, they made a public display of what they were doing. The largest square in Berlin is the Bibelplatz, and what they did is they built a giant bonfire in that square. And they started burning the books that they had collected over all of those months. This was actually filmed, and it was made into a movie short. And so everyone who went to the movies would see that this was happening in Berlin. And in the next month, 93 more book burnings occurred. The destruction of books would continue. By the time VE Day came around, 375 archives in Europe were destroyed, 402 museums were destroyed, and 957 libraries were destroyed. One estimate is that 100 million books were burned by VE Day in Europe. So naturally, American librarians were outraged by this. They did not like this idea of books being burned, and they worried, what if the war were to come over to America? Would we have to watch our books being burned? And they started to understand this war as being something of ideas. Ideas were under attack, and they wanted to figure out what they could do to counterattack in this war. But it's kind of a nebulous idea. I mean, ideas are being destroyed. How do you fight that destruction? And they weren't really sure what the answer was. And so for years, they debated this and kind of waited for an opportunity to do something. And that opportunity came in 1941 when the first peacetime draft in American history occurred. At the same time as Congress passed legislation for the draft, they passed legislation for the funding for the creation of camps so that people could go and train and learn how to become soldiers and sailors and Marines. So the problem was people were being drafted into the services before there were barracks for them to live in, before there were classrooms where they could learn how to operate weapons and have battle plans, and they actually lived in tent cities. And a lot of these tent cities were in the northeast of the United States. And I can say as someone from New York, you do not want to live in a tent in the dead of winter. It's just not comfortable. There's no heat. They would start fires sometimes to try to heat the tents, and they'd set the tents on fire. They were living in very close quarters with strangers. They had no privacy, no escape, no entertainment. They'd wake up at 6 a.m., go through military drills, spend the day outdoors doing different things to try to learn how to become soldiers, and then they would find themselves at night just sitting in a tent with nothing to do. The Army realized they had a morale problem pretty quickly. The Army had a motto that a happy soldier was a better soldier, and what they had were hundreds of thousands of unhappy soldiers. And so naturally they thought, let's give them some kind of entertainment, so at night they'd have something to do. But if they didn't have barracks built, they couldn't exactly build a movie theater or some other kind of housing for entertainment. And so they realized, what about books? They're small, they're portable, they could go in these tents, and they'd give men something to do after having a long day of training. The only problem was they didn't have money to buy books. And this is where the librarians came in, who wanted to do something to fight this war of ideas. They thought, what if we host a book campaign where we ask the public to donate books that they like reading, and we'll send all these books to the Army and the Navy where they need entertainment for the men who are training. And so this is when the Victory Book Campaign was born. Beginning in January of 1942, on the steps of the legendary New York Public Library, celebrities, musicians, politicians, and Army officials came together to explain to the public how this was a war of ideas and they needed books to arm the minds of the men who would actually face battle and go into these areas where books were being banned and burned. And it was just an amazing outpouring of support. Thousands of books were donated each day. In New York City, 2 million books were collected between January and May. Nationwide, they collected 10 million books between January and May. And so this seemed like a very successful program. The librarians felt really good about the work that they had done. But what do you notice about the collections that they had? These books are all hardcover. And that's okay if you're at a stationary training camp or if you're on a boat, if you're in the Navy. But in 1942, the nature of war had changed. We weren't just training for defense anymore. We were actually engaged in war. These are American soldiers in North Africa, and you can see that they've been marching for quite a while. You can see that they're carrying bags on their backs, and you've got their weapons sticking out. They're carrying all of their possessions on them. And if they wanted entertainment, and you can see from the picture, it's not like there's movie theaters around here that they can go to if they want to relax at night. They needed to carry the entertainment with them. And so initially, many of them carried these books that had been donated by American civilians. But mile after mile, these books got heavier and heavier. There are stories of men stopping briefly to go through their pack and figuring out if there's anything that they could get rid of. Some people even threw away their gas masks because they wanted to get rid of that weight, and they figured that they might not have to use them. And so, as you might guess, books started to not make the cut. And it's not because they didn't want to read books, it's just because they were too heavy to carry. So something needed to happen, and you probably are thinking, why not just have paperback books for the soldiers? Well, the paperback industry hadn't really taken off in the United States yet. In 1939, there was only 200,000 paperbacks that were printed. And so if you have librarians collecting 10 million hardcovers, 200,000 paperbacks was just a drop in the bucket. But book publishers got an idea from magazines. In the 1940s, the most popular magazine in the United States was the Saturday Evening Post. And I brought the 1942 Saturday Evening Post to show you. It was a big magazine. If you open it up, I mean, it's giant. It's also heavy. The paper is really high quality. It probably weighs over a pound. And the Saturday Evening Post realized they wanted to do something for the American servicemen, but sending this size magazine was not going to do the trick. And so what they did is they decided to print a special magazine that had no advertisements in it at all. It just had the articles, it had some of the cartoons, and it actually was pocket-sized. So I have one in my pocket right now. This is the Saturday Evening Post that was sent to servicemen. So you can see this is a huge improvement. And because it fit in the pocket, anytime that the men could stop marching and were told to wait for a few minutes, they could just pull this out of their pocket and start reading. And so publishers of books started to think, well, if magazines can do that, what can we do? So there's the two different magazines side by side. And so book publishers decided, let's print paperbacks. But they didn't want to print paperbacks because paperbacks were only 25 cents on the domestic market. Hardcovers could sell for $3. So the profit margin was huge for hardcovers, and there wasn't much money to be made on paperbacks. And so what they decided to do was to make an agreement with the Army and the Navy that all the paperbacks that they printed had to go overseas immediately. They did not want these on the domestic market. And so what they created was something called the Armed Services Editions. They were these miniature paperbacks. The smallest was 3.5 by 5.5 inches, and the larger was 4.5 by 6.5 inches. So I've got one in my other pocket to show you. They were truly pocket-sized, and they were intentionally created to fit in the pockets of a military uniform. And so this was no longer an issue of trying to cram something into your pack. This was something that you could just have at your fingertips anytime you wanted one. I was at one talk and someone came up to me at the end and said, "Do you have anything else in your pockets?" So I'm just going to tell you, that's it for the pockets. So not only were these smaller books, but they were thinner. And so this is a picture of the same book. It's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And you can see the hardcover is much thicker. They used newsprint for the interior pages so that they would be much thinner and also more lightweight. The books all look like this. The back cover would have a short summary of the contents of the book, and then you'll see the inside pages had 2 columns of text. So publishers really went out of their way to figure out how to make a book that really suited those in the services best. And they realized that these were men who did not have lamps that they could read under. These were men who were out in the field. And so to be able to read under poor lighting conditions, the smaller the columns of text, the easier it is on your eyes. And so they made the columns very, very small so that it would be easy for them to read. So each month they would send 30 to 42 titles, and the inside back cover would list them all. And so if there was a certain title or an author that someone really wanted to read, they could just check the back cover, and if it was there, someone in their unit had it. And so they could hunt it down and find it and read it. So what kind of books were sent? You had a really diverse military in the 1940s. You had guys who had gone through West Point, and then you also had civilian soldiers who hadn't even made it through high school. So you needed to have books that would appeal to a very broad range. And so I'd like to show you a few of the books that were sent out. So alongside Shakespeare, there was sad sack comics. There were histories and westerns. Incidentally, General Dwight Eisenhower loved reading westerns. It made him relax while he was at war. There were classics, and there were books that were so indecent that they were banned in the United States. And I just want to point out, Moby Dick is in pristine condition, whereas Strange Fruit, which had sex scenes, is not. And you can get a closer look. You can see the cover is creased, it's taped at the spine, the pages are loose, and still that book was never thrown out, and it still is around today. And so they went around quite a bit. There were books that bred nostalgia, like Lassie Come Home. There were sports books and mysteries. There were short stories and poems, so if you only had a few minutes, you could just read something short and you'd have the satisfaction of getting through it. There was culture books, there was jazz and music and artwork, and there was also a very precious commodity to be had, and that was humor. The publishers really went out of their way to make sure they had a little bit of everything, so everyone would have something that they could enjoy. And so I can tell you right now that the books were incredibly popular, but I feel like a much more poignant way of making that point is having the words of the servicemen themselves tell you what these books meant to them. And that's something that I do in my book. And so what I'd like to do is tell you about 2 different books and read to you letters that the servicemen had written to these authors to tell them what the books meant to them. One question that I'm always asked is, what was the most popular book that was sent overseas? It's hard to know the answer to that because there was no circulation tabs that were kept on these books. They were just free books that you could grab and read if you wanted to. But if you measure popularity by the number of letters that an author received, then by far, Betty Smith, the author of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, won. She received over 10,000 letters from those in the services who had read her book, and they just felt that they had to tell her what it meant to them. And so I'm going to read a letter to you, and you can judge for yourself the power that this book had on the young civilian soldiers who went overseas. The letter opened up asking, were you ever upset emotionally that you had to tell someone about it, to sit down and write it out? Somehow, I think you have. At least that's what I gathered from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. That is how I feel now. I feel that I'll never be square with myself unless I thank you for writing this book. You see, I am a 20-year-old Marine, but I feel twice that age. I went through hell in 2 years of combat overseas. For the last 2 weeks, I have been flat on my back with repeated attacks of malaria. I just wanted you to understand that despite my youth, I have seen a little bit of suffering. While I have been here in sick bay, I have had access to the Armed Forces edition of A Tree. I have read it twice and am halfway through it again, and every time I read it, I feel it more deeply than I did before. Ever since the first time I struggled through knee-deep mud, carrying a stretcher from which my buddy's life dripped away in precious blood, and I was powerless to help him, I have felt hard and cynical against this world, and have felt sure that I was no longer capable of loving anything or anybody. I can't explain the emotional reaction that took place in this dead heart of mine and dulled mind. I only know that it happened, and that this heart of mine turned over and became alive again. As I write this, my heart cries out with joy and gratitude. I'm not ashamed of, but instead extremely proud of the tears that have rolled down my cheeks as I reread this story I have learned to love. I suppose it's unusual for a supposedly battle-hardened Marine to do such an effeminate thing as weep over a piece of fiction, but I feel human again. Please don't think you have to answer this, though an understanding letter from you would mean one hell of a lot to me, because I've gotten this off my chest. I don't think I would have been able to sleep this night unless I had bared my heart to the person who caused it to live again. A second letter that she had received, and she received so many letters that just make you want to cry. And she said that getting letters every day just brought tears to her eyes. But another person kept a copy of The Truth Goes to Brooklyn with him throughout the war. And he wrote to her at the end of the war. He was actually in a hospital and he was going home. And he just said, I wanted you to know that it's your book that helped me survive. And so he was going home to join his wife, and they were planning on starting a family. And he said that if they had a girl, they were going to name her Betty Smith in honor of the woman who caused him to live. On a different note, though, I would like to tell you about the book, The Education of Hyman Kaplan. So 40 years after the Armed Services Editions program, the Library of Congress held this huge gala to celebrate the authors and publishers who participated in the program. And the author of this book was asked, what was the most meaningful part of being an Armed Services Edition author? And he said this letter. And this is what it said. I want to thank you profoundly for myself, and more importantly, for the men here in this God-forsaken part of the globe. We fry by day, we freeze by night. What we are doing near the Persian Gulf, no one knows. All we have for recreation is a ping pong set with one paddle only. Last week you received your book on Mr. Kaplan. I read it and simply roared with laughter. As an experiment, I read it one night at campfire. The men howled. I have not heard such laughs in months. Now they demand I only read one Kaplan story a night. It's our ration on pleasure. So, the books were obviously a huge hit. And between 1943 and 1947, 123 million of these miniature paperbacks were distributed overseas to the men who were serving in Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, all of the fronts. And these books were not meant to stay with one person. They were supposed to be passed on to the next person until they finally wore out. But as you saw from Strange Fruit, a lot of them didn't wear out, and they were so precious that you would never throw one out. One man said to throw one out was tantamount to striking your grandmother. Now, this program really had a long-term effect, though, on American life. Books were a luxury commodity in the 1930s. Hardcovers were really expensive, and so most people didn't have the opportunity to read. But here, you have this war that was being fought in the name of democracy, and you had books that were distributed in a democratic manner. Anybody could read any of the books that were sent to them. And paperbacks became really important to these men. Lots of them came home and they wanted to continue this habit of carrying a paperback on them so that if they were stuck waiting anywhere, they could start reading. And so publishers realized that they could actually profit off of paperbacks because of the sheer quantity that they could sell. And so in the 1940s, there was an explosion of the paperback industry. I told you only 200,000 were printed in 1939. By 1947, 95 million were published. 250 million in 1952. And in 1959, more paperbacks were printed than hardcovers for the first time in history. So that was great for the book industry, but personally, for the men who had read at war, there was a second thing that really was significant for them in having this opportunity to read while at war, and that was the GI Bill. The GI Bill, among many other things, had a provision where if you're honorably discharged, you could get a free college education. This was huge. In the 1940s, college cost anywhere between $500 and $1,000 a year, but the average salary for a household was $1,000 a year. And so you pretty much went to college only if you belonged to a wealthy family. But with the GI Bill, all of a sudden it didn't matter what your wealth was. Anybody could go to college on the government's dime. And what you have is this generation of Americans who realized by being at war and having an opportunity to read books that they enjoyed doing something as scholarly as reading. And so many of them decided that they would go ahead and try to go to college and see if they could succeed. And they were actually incredibly diligent students. In fact, in one California university, veterans were known as DARs, not Daughters of the American Revolution, but damned average raisers. The civilian students couldn't stand having veterans in their class because they were so disciplined and they wanted these degrees so badly that they really applied themselves and did a wonderful job in their classes and earned top grades. And so part of the reason why college, I think, has taken off so much in this country is because in the 1940s, the greatest generation went to college, and then they wanted to send their children to college. And reading obviously exploded as a result of these programs. And so I will be signing books in a few minutes, and if you'd like to see some armed services editions, or if you'd like to see these magazines that were printed in miniature form, I will have some at my table. I think I have time for maybe a question, if anybody would like to ask one. Sure.
How did you come to this subject?
How did I come to this subject? This is actually my second book, and my first book was about an author named Arthur Train, and two of his books are printed as armed services editions. And so when I was in archives and I was reading about his books, I kept finding these letters from service people saying how much they enjoyed these books, and I had no idea what they were talking about because I didn't see any paperbacks by Arthur Train because they weren't meant to be on the domestic market, so they were all pretty much in Europe. And then I didn't know what an armed services edition was, so I did some digging and I realized no one had ever published anything about this amazing program, and it really changed our society, I think, and I felt like it had to be told. And so that's how I found it. Thank you.